Oh, hello. I'm hoping that Thomas McCormack finds me and joins me shortly because myself and Thomas are meant to have a little chat. Instagram Live. Okay, Thomas. Okay, so hopefully I've done that correctly. Hello. There's a few of you joining us, so thank you. Um, Thomas should be with me in a second. It'll be more exciting. There we go. Giving Instagram a second to figure it out, giving me a second to figure out Instagram. We're going to talk a little bit about inclusive leadership, surprise, surprise, um, and some of the things Thomas thinks is a good idea to discuss. Okay, so we'll give Thomas that second to join us. Okay. I don't usually go live. I usually use LinkedIn or go live on YouTube. So it's interesting to have a chat with Thomas. One of the things that Thomas and I were joking about before this was that I'm not feeling well. I have a little bit of something brewing, and so does he. So we were like, this is going to be the least sexy call you could have with the state of our sniffles and our throats and our voices. So finally, Thomas.
I was there watching you for a minute, going, "How come it's not letting me in?" But we're here.
We're here. I had to invite you in a second time. Yeah, and I'm not great with Instagram, so that's interesting. Yeah, I was saying you don't look too sick. And you don't, I don't think you have makeup on like I do to try and hide it.
No, I definitely don't. Well, you could say I'm well positioned. I've got a nice light here,
Oh,
and and I was lucky. My housemate's a nurse, so she gave me a few tips last night, which have helped a lot.
oh, nice,
Yeah.
nice. Okay. So how will we kick this off? What are you thinking in terms of how we discuss this?
Well, I guess how we discuss it. I guess alignment of values might be a good place to start. Like, why are the two of us having this conversation, for example?
Yeah, yeah. So I might start by saying how we met because I think that was really interesting. Um, we met because you randomly emailed me, I think, having found my card somewhere. Like we just happened to cross, we didn't physically cross paths, but like our business cards cross paths at some point, which sounds odd. But what was interesting was that week, I think you might be the fourth person to contact me to meet. And I, I said no to the other three for a couple of reasons. I wasn't sure why they wanted to meet. I was like, I don't know what they want from me. But there was something in the way you reached out, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. So we met. Um, and to me, anyway, it became really obvious while we had very different views and very different experiences, we seemed to share an appreciation of centering the whole person in our work and also thinking about the fact that when we compartmentalize people or we cut off parts of their identity or their experience, that doesn't work very well, either in their lives or in their working lives. So that would be kind of how I initially felt we were aligned. Which has kind of led us to this conversation. But I suppose I'm wondering what words you'd put on that in terms of what alignment you see.
For me, yeah, it's the sense of wholeness or humanistic perspective and working in that direction without feeling that we should be there already. Um,
Yes, yeah, it was that interest in learning, but not shaming for not knowing. That kind of
yeah, that was for me. Like I think I could, without. I don't think I would have had the words at the time or a lot of the journey even, but it was like that. I could feel it in your presence. There wasn't, even though internally I was immensely critical, and didn't realize it. This is the thing. I didn't know it. Um, there was something in your presence which allowed more of me to slowly show up. And when I when so your program around lead in and the whole journey and everything, like this is uh, real substance. I'm taking words from your website here, I think. Real substance
I don't know
over
if I said that, but I'll
or
take it because it's
okay,
true.
yeah. Go for it. The real substance over superficial vanity, and that's what I found hard everywhere I was looking. I didn't have the words, but that was a crucial piece, if that makes sense.
Mm. And it's interesting because I think like when we met, one of the things I found fascinating about you was your ability to actually be present with whatever way I was or whatever was happening for me, or like whatever conversation I was having, whether we were talking about like far off galaxy stuff, or we were talking about practical barriers and disadvantage, or we were talking about the implementation of, you know, an approach. You could show up to each of those, and that was because there was an openness to that isn't actually that common. I don't think. I think we think we're open, but I think your practice of openness, because it's more than listening, you know, kind of made me be like, this is interesting. This means something. You know what I mean? This is really helpful. And I suppose we're talking about LEADIN because you're doing it with us, which is brilliant. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But also, it's the first time that I've launched it with the term LEADIN, so it's kind of like branded now. But it's been, I think it's gone through maybe 9 or 10 iterations really over the last 4 years, and we've been talking about it really for the last 4 years in part without necessarily using the label.
So where did it start, Sheila? Like where did this LEADIN journey start? Or when you say there was different iterations, like what does that mean?
Yeah, like if I'm honest, it started with me being in school and like very dyslexic, very neurodiverse, very stubborn person. Being in a school system and really doing really badly, even though I tried really, really hard. But at the same time, I was working part-time somewhere and I was thriving. I was like the youngest pastry chef there. I, you know, was running the pastry section at like 60, like, see, so I was like, something's going on, because in one setting, I can't keep my head above water. And in another setting, it couldn't be easier. And I suppose what that made me think about, and I didn't have the language then, obviously, was the fact that actually environment sets people up to succeed and fail, which has later gone on to be like the psychodynamic systemic coaching that I do, thinking about the individual as an individual, but also as part of a collective, even if they aren't the same as the collective. And then LEADIN came out of, well, I had a little bit of an issue with the fact that most inclusive leadership or diversity work was indirectly stereotyping and ignoring that, yes, people who experience marginalization, as a person who's experienced it one form or another, do need to be included and considered. And that is true. But also, inclusive practices are good for everybody. Like, everybody benefits from them. There's nobody gets more or less. If you're using inclusive practices, then regardless of someone's identity, you can take that into account as they require and as they need. And I suppose what was frustrating me as a dyslexic who joins all the dots, as somebody who'd been supervising for a couple of years, working in coaching psychology, I was like, we're missing something very basic in all this attempts to be better towards each other, where we are creating divides that aren't necessarily leveraging differences and adding value, but actually are creating sometimes a kind of form of like the oppression Olympics, or a form of, oh, I practice inclusion because I identify this person, like Sheila has dyslexia, so I'm inclusive of, I ask her this question, but I don't ask the other 10 people in the room who have different needs. So I guess LEADIN came from that kind of sense that we are, with the best intentions in the world, we might be undermining the very thing we're trying to achieve. And I do think we need differences, and we need to ensure that we're considering marginalization, definitely. However, if we only focus on those, what starts to happen is we don't make room for the conversations that need to happen, because we start making rules about what can and can't be said. But also we stop kind of realizing that inclusion, which is what results in more innovation, creativity, stronger influence, you know, links to like better turnover, loads of those things, isn't just because we get a load of people in the room that look different. It's because we know how to harness people with all sorts of differences to work together effectively to create better outcomes. And I kind of felt like that was getting lost, because it was almost like when we talked about inclusion, we were only talking about including a certain group, which automatically creates exclusion. And then when we were talking about inclusion, we were only looking at where there's kind of like biases or inherent exclusion, rather than, look, this is my coaching psychology background, thinking about inclusion as a method of supporting organizations to perform, a method of supporting every single employee who thrive at work, a method of that we offer to everyone, not just to people we have deemed as the other, which is kind of still centering this idea of like one group are the norm and other identities are abnormal, or the other. If we actually think about inclusion in the way that I'm talking about it, we're not centering anything. We're just centering that humans are different, and that those differences do require different needs, do have different power struggles, do have different barriers. But if we're going to think about inclusion in organizations, we need to think about how it lends to being effective as leaders, how it supports turnover, how it supports employee retention, but not just retaining employees. Let's help them thrive. Let's help them do better work. Let's think about their well-being, because they go out into society, they raise families, they have connections, they have brothers, they have friends, they have sisters. And inclusive leadership kind of seems to, at least those who've done LEADIN, seems to improve relationships, generally, is the feedback I've heard, but also more self-acceptance. Because if we're thinking about inclusive leadership through the lens of, I'm going to show up and have an impact where I can regulate myself so I can include people with different points of view, different lived experiences, I can make room for more innovative and creative outcomes, then I actually have better days at work as well, rather than facing into inclusion or diversity as a thing I'm going to be caught out on. I'm going to do something wrong, I'm going to be cancelled on. And so I suppose I was kind of going, I get the intentions of working here, but something is missing. And then a lot of the time in the training, the first iterations, it was about how to be inclusive of others, which was really good. But I realized that when you're asking a group of people who haven't been included themselves in their full identity, and there was no identity I've worked with, and I've worked with, like, I won't say all identities because there's, intersectionality, but I've worked with people of all sorts of experiences. I've yet to find someone who didn't have a barrier in their experience to inclusion. It may not have been based on discrimination law. The barrier could have been something else, like class isn't accounted for in discrimination law in most places. Bullying isn't accounted for. Yes, it's in a different piece, but if you've been bullied, you've been overtly othered. It's the same techniques that are used to other any other group. So the same practices that result in othering, lots of people have experienced for different reasons and to different degrees. So I don't want to pretend it's all the same. But if we teach inclusion as something that is good for everybody, and that everybody actually has a little bit of work to do themselves, so that they understand what parts of themselves they deny, reject, judge, so that they can then step into then doing that for others. Whereas a lot of the time we teach people like, here's your unconscious bias training, this is what you've done, don't feel bad, but kind of do feel bad. And people go feeling shame and guilt, and privilege goes down badly with people. Whereas I suppose what I figured out with LEADIN is, if we use a humanistic lens and we say, look, there are differences, those differences have different levels of barriers, unfortunately. So there are people who have less barriers based on certain things. So race, we can't suggest that a white person's having the same experience as somebody else who isn't white. We can't assume that. But we can say that doesn't mean that white person has never felt othered. So yes, there is privilege and usually a lot of white guilt, but we also need to get around that and move forward and say, well, what do we do with our privilege, instead of getting lost in that kind of, it's a really clever way actually of like blocking ourselves from accountability, is getting lost in our own inertia of like guilt, privilege. We need to own our privilege and say, what do we do with this? But also, if we don't accept the parts of us that are othered, that we haven't got a relationship with, we're going to be harsher towards others that say, like, this is the part of me that's othered and rejected. And we'll be like, oh, just get on with it. Usually those people have just got on with it themselves, which is why they're, maybe not in the same context, but around. So I suppose LEADIN, the more I was working with it and I had a coaching psychology lens on it, the more I realized actually inclusive leadership has to be about supporting organizational performance. That's not the same for society, by the way. I have a different position on society, because everyone in society should be equally included. But in organizations, there are limits to entry for different reasons and valid reasons, like, do you need a certain type of degree? Do you need to be registered as a certain professional? But within those boundaries, inclusion needs to support the task at hand and ensure that the organisation is legally compliant. Well, there's lots of attention on the legal compliance. Not a lot of people know what the practices of inclusion are, so that they are inclusive and engaging in inclusion at every level, not just when they see someone as the other. Because that's that weird stereotype that makes it really awkward. I'm like, if you didn't, yeah, it's kind of like it ends up having the opposite impact to what's being hoped for. And so I just realized that, look, taking a coaching psychology lens, understanding systems, which is a big part of my work, started to point out that well-intentioned interventions were actually leaving a lot of leaders and managers confused. They were like, yeah, but I can't always do that, or do I always do that? I can't know everything about every single group that's ever existed. What do I do? And I suppose that's where LEADIN kind of emerged from, was, well, what's practical without pretending it's not complex? And also, what is doable for managers and leaders in the reality of their work that can result in inclusive experiences for all, and better experiences for all, including the leader and the manager, which is one of the things that gets lost. It's like, you've got to deliver this for others, but you don't need to think about yourself in this way, or what you need to thrive. So that's how it's got here. And I have to say, it's got here not because of the content I deliver, while I hope that was a trigger point for it. It's got here because of the participants who have robustly worked with the process. So they have informed it, and that's the iterations again and again. The more I've worked with, the more I've kind of seen the patterns, see the challenges, able to find more helpful ways to support people in actually applying inclusive leadership, so that they are both inclusive and effectively leading, rather than they're inclusive and maybe not being very effective in their leadership, or vice versa, they're being an effective leader but they're not actually inclusive in the process, so there's a short-term gain to it. So that's kind of how it got to where it is today, at this point.
Okay. Your passion and energy comes across quite strong and slowly.
I'm like, stop talking, let Thomas get a word in.
No, I like it. So am I hearing that there's something, because I think this is the part, it's like when there's a few things you said and I was like, oh, they're the parts that really hold me in terms of substance. Like, you make space for the stuff that people like to, there's more space for the uncomfortable stuff without us having to, would I be right in saying that?
Yeah, but I would also say, unlike some trainings I've sat in on, there is space for the uncomfortable stuff, but we're not trying to make you uncomfortable, I suppose. So it's usually what comes up is the stuff people are carrying that makes them avoid certain conversations because they're not sure how to have them. So that it's not like we set up the scene. You know, the way in some unconscious bias training, someone sets the scene to show you that you have unconscious bias. I don't believe in that. I don't think that's psychologically safe. I personally think that it's a bad way to learn, bringing shame and shoulds into it. So what we do is the space for the questions people have, the confusion that they have, which is reasonable and normal. We just make space so that can be normalized. And then we can actually talk about it. Like, bias is absolutely central to survival. There's no issue with that. The issue is when your bias becomes a limitation in something that you're trying to achieve. Okay, how do we help you with that? But like, for instance, with all the like, I'd say thousands now, actually, if I think about the numbers that have gone through this, we do very little talking about unconscious bias because they've heard all about that. They kind of know what that is. What they're struggling with is, how do I intercept it? What do I do when I know that I'm having some kind of bias that I'm not sure how to get around, and I'm not sure whether to check if it's true or it's bias? Like, we talk about that practical stuff, not just like, you should be unconsciously biased and this is what you do not to be. We talk about the kind of moments that are challenging because people are feeling that or having that experience, not because we like formulate it in the program to like make you uncomfortable. But it is a space where conversations that are not being had, questions that are not being asked, are asked. And then we have meaningful understanding of that conversation, and people leave far more confident about being in the conversations. But that doesn't mean we tell them what to say, which is kind of a traditional way of training. We help them understand how to inform what they say, what principles they use, what questions they could ask. So they leave feeling more confident, but I would go further and they leave far more competent, which is often not really what's coming out of some, and not in a criticizing way, just in a depending on what level people are at in the work, sometimes it's only knowledge intake they can do. So they do know things, but it doesn't mean they know how to implement them. And so their competence might not be improved, but they might be confident and have knowledge. We do a good bit on the competence. How are you applying this? How would you get out of a sticky situation? How would you handle some of the nuances that are not fixable? How would you navigate some of the discussions in the workplace at the moment? So it's very much like we're kind of all in it together, and that's kind of true. We are. So yeah, so we do facilitate uncomfortable conversations, but I think it's important to know they're the things that you need help with, that you have brought to the group. I don't create an uncomfortable conversation, because I just think that's important, because sometimes that's set up in training, but we're not doing that. You're bringing your real life challenges and we're working through them to help you be comfortable with them, and have some kind of critical decision making that you can utilize around them, rather than saying this is good or this is bad.
Okay, so there's something. So what's the movement of this course then? Because, for example, in my head, if I was going to other courses, I'd automatically think, based on other experiences I've had, that it's a lot of content led. You come in, you feel good because you've gone there, versus this sounds different because you can bring your experiences in. So I'll just put the question over to you. So what does that actually, what does it look like? How does it inform competence? And why would this be of value? So go wherever you want
Okay,
with that.
3 questions. You'll have to remind me, because between the brain fog now and the cold. So the first thing I suppose I would say is that over the 10 weeks of lead in, um, we only meet 6 times, so that's important, and they're for 2-hour sessions. 3 of them are led by me, and 3 are hosted by Rebecca. Those 3 that are hosted by Rebecca are designed that peer-to-peer learning occurs, but we give a very particular format for that. The sessions led by me, we are discussing the unspeakable parts, the confusion, the fears. We're speaking about the unsaid stuff, the unconscious stuff as well. I don't mean bias, but why might that be sticky for us? We kind of have the meaningful conversations. The other part is, because of the supervision that I do and the practice that I have, we also think about it from an anti-oppressive lens, meaning that we think about how you're using power, how you relate to power, how that comes into inclusion, how it limits inclusion, how it can support inclusion. And usually my experience of inclusive leadership and diversity and inclusion efforts doesn't always consider how we're using power in the room with each other. It just kind of talks about it like it's only happening outside the room. The other thing that is different is, I was trying to work out how I do something that's highly responsive and tailored while also having some core, pieces. And one of the ways that we're doing it, which I think is going to be really powerful this time, is there's a bonus of Voxer, which means while you're working through the materials on your own, you're sending voicemails. How does that work for this, Sheila? I was thinking about that. Does this relate to this? And we're actually working together throughout the week, not just in the group. And then those questions are also answered at the end of the week for everyone in a recorded video. So we have all this shared learning, but it's really tailored. Because you can ask the questions you can't ask in the group, because I bring the question anonymously to the group and share my answer and considerations, but I also reply to you privately. So you're getting live in the moment help. So while there is a core content, that content is guiding your thinking, expanding your understanding of the topic, but the way you're implementing it every single day, you have someone to touch base with. And that means that you're actually implementing and learning in application, not just in theory. So that is wildly different. So when you ring and you say, people, they come into inclusive leadership training sometimes and they say things like, how can I be inclusive of everyone? And I'm like, okay, well, why do you want to be inclusive of everyone? Let's get past it's a morally good thing. And then they're like, well, I have a team and this is the issue. I'm like, great. When you're dealing with that team next week, try one of these things, pop me a message, let me know how it went. I'll come back to you with maybe some additional questions. And so you have this live learning process, which does not come with usual training. And that's really because I'm using a coaching psychology lens. I'm using the idea that you have a lot of the answers within you, but you also need some shapes and some insights to know how to access that. So the people who lead in never lead the same way. They lead as themselves, but they have skills, tools, and practices that they've utilized that engage inclusive leadership. And that's unusual, because usually in training like this, or even in leadership training, people will position something as best, good, right. That's not what we're doing. We're doing evidence tells us this, research says this, industry says this, I'm curious about what's happening in this situation with X, Y, and Z. So it's a very different learning approach. There's multiple learning preferences being met there. And then critical thinking is also central. In a lot of training, we aren't encouraging critical thinking. What we're encouraging is agreement. And if you teach inclusive leadership through an agreement lens, you're teaching something you're not practicing. So we do a lot of provoking critical thought, find flaws, find nuances, find things that break the rules so that you have a robust understanding of the topic. I suppose I deliver inclusive leadership training for multiple organisations, the British Psychological Society, Right Point Global, Roffey Park, and repeatedly the one thing that I can say comes across all those organisations when I deliver is people actually say, thank you for not just talking about inclusive leadership, but demonstrating it in how you engaged with us.
Okay.
And I was like, oh yeah, that's very polite. But it's come up so many times, I now know. And then usually they're like, never seen this before, never had anyone teach this so inclusively. And I'm kind of like, in the beginning, because I don't really take compliments very easily, I was like, oh yeah, Grant, maybe, maybe they've just never had that experience. But I have had that so many times over the last 2 years that now I realize that a lot of the time we are teaching inclusive leadership content, but we are not practicing inclusive leadership practices within the classroom of teaching the content. So we've always got content and process. And that's one way that I teach inclusive leadership, is helping participants of LEADIN think about the content of their meetings, the problems they're solving, the challenges they have. And we also discuss it in an inclusive leadership process. So we're getting the practice in the rooms for the very things we want to do out there in the world. We're not just talking about what we're doing. Participants then go practice and they get to Voxer and be like, this went well, they push back on this, I'm feeling this, and I can come back and ask some key questions to help them reflect or give them some pointers, or say, oh, I wonder what was happening there with power, I wonder what was going on in you that you felt you had to answer that question, so they actually get that personal feedback without having to pay loads and loads of money for that level of coaching. But the whole program is based on that kind of coaching approach, that leaders actually just need to be kitted out with the tools and insights and understandings and frameworks of looking at the problems that they face that align with inclusion. So that's very different. And then the other thing that's different is, people always say this, oh yeah, your learning will come from your peers. It does. In LEADIN, when people are waiting, and we've done this, we've reviewed this in some of the classes, when people are waiting for me to talk and wanting to hurry up with their peers, it is a key indicator that they're not going to be able to practice inclusive leadership, because they haven't yet learned to listen equally regardless of positional power, or you know what I mean. So it's like, I can only learn off the most senior person in the room, or like I can only learn off Sheila, the facilitator. And so even that example has taught people, they're like, oh my God, I don't listen to my peers. Even if I disagree with them, I don't listen to think about that. I kind of think, oh, hurry up, I want to go back to the important person talking. And so that's the kind of stuff we talk about. That's not often talked about in training, because it's nice to be the important person, but it's just not good inclusive leadership, and it doesn't result in capacity building or competency building or, true inclusive leadership practices. So we practice what we preach. We bring critical thinking. We marry experiential experiences with research-driven insights. We take industry practicalities and challenges into account, not just academic ideas of what should or shouldn't happen. And we don't just learn off me. Okay. We learn off the ways other people are relating to the content challenged, who you like, who you dislike in the program, what's happening in you. You learn off everything. The whole thing is a learning experience. It's not just the content is what you learn.
Okay. So it really feels like it's a live ecosystem, where the whole ecosystem of people, yourself, the trainer, the whole feed, like it feels like all the pieces feed into each other, versus there just being one generator, let's say, and everyone just kind of takes it in.
So I love that, because I started by generating something, by putting some thoughts in, some research, some case studies, some challenges, but then the ecosystem brings it to life. And like an example of this was, Rebecca is like a God's send to me in this piece of work, right? And you'll get to know Rebecca from being on the program. Rebecca was like, what tone do you want me to write emails in? Should I tone down this? Should I tone up that? Is it okay to say this? Is it okay to say that? And I was like, Rebecca, you are you. As long as you aren't rude or discriminate, you be you. I am not going to regulate how you speak, because that would not be what I do. So even in my own business, even with Rebecca helping, Rebecca was like, okay, what are the rules? How am I allowed to be myself? What am I not allowed to be? And I'm like, but that would defeat the whole thing.
Okay.
You know, there are boundaries, like, do not discriminate. If something comes up, I will communicate it with you. You don't have to guess, you know, treat people with respect. If we get feedback that something isn't respectful, we will think about it, reflect on it, and learn. But this is a learning process. And I don't want people, even if they're representing my brand, to have to be me or like neutralize themselves to what I think the brand is. The core brand is that I leverage differences and I respect it, and that including people with different perspectives is really helpful. And so that was an example where Rebecca's like, oh, okay, so I don't have to, okay, so I don't, like, basically I don't have to be kind of corrected by me to do what she does. Like, she thrives, she does her own thing, she makes a big difference to the program, she has a very different style to me, it will add value. But that's like this key example of how the ecosystem isn't coming from me. But if I was to tell her what she can and can't say, how she should be, you know, what is professional. Now, professional to me, just to be clear to everyone, is that I practice professionalism through how I behave and treat people, not through my identity, because I'm a person, I'm not a profession. So my personhood fulfills the profession. So we do have professional kind of senses of things, and Rebecca has loads of that. But I'm not going to try and make her be something. And I do the same with all the participants. Like, when you bring yourself, there's not one participant that has ever entered into the previous iterations of this that didn't bring something I couldn't have designed into the program. The program is what it is because of all of the previous participants, and all of the participants who join in every single cohort bring a richness that I cannot design, that I cannot create, that are not generated from me. They're actually collectively generated. So I bring the research, I bring some foundations, I bring some starting points. That's what the kind of lessons each week are. But those 6 sessions with each other, the Voxers, the group connections, that's actually where the ecosystem regenerates itself, nurtures itself, challenges some maybe unconscious assumptions that all of us have, including me, and we can kind of grow more collective, insightful ways of being effective. So I love the term ecosystem, and even the third module is ecosystem building. It's not networking, it's ecosystem. Because when we think about it as an ecosystem, we think about how the ecosystem has interdependencies. When we think about it as networking, we think about transactional, give me, I give you. We have interdependencies. We can't exist in workplaces and be included if people aren't supported to figure that out, and to have safe spaces to figure that out and have those conversations.
Okay. I have so many questions. Okay, the first one is, I think both of us at the very beginning said something about having an experience but not having the language in
Yeah.
different ways. And then when you're speaking about the course, you're saying that the feedback that you got time and time again is that people are, I guess the feedback, I guess the way I heard it was that the feedback that you got from people is that the experience they have of you in the room helps them connect with the content in a way that it makes sense versus just being delivered content. So your live behaviors and living of this inclusive way of being, where you're, for example, you were saying there about Rebecca, she's a different way of being and doing things, and she's permission to do that. So there's something about is there anything you want to say? There's stuff I thought myself, but my question was, is there something there about this program that's about the experience and you living it and the content matching up, and then what that allows people in the program to access that they can't in other programs? That's what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, no, brilliant. So what I will say is, people do say, Sheila, the way you did it is great, or whatever, right? But what I will say is, I think that's a projection, because I've honed down a great deal of my own practice around, facilitation, coaching, psychology. Like, I've honed that so well that what they're actually experiencing is happening in the group, but they think it's me because I'm setting it up to happen that way. Like, I'm doing group agreements, or I'm helping people think about the things that make us unsafe. But actually the group are doing it, but it's just easy to think it's me because I'm the one kind of provoking us to consider it, you know. And it's just a natural thing people project on the person facilitating, but actually it's the group, because if the group wasn't engaging that way, they wouldn't have that experience. One person can't do that. So that's one of the key things, is we learn how to support, leverage, influence groups to perform better in how they engage with each other. And we do that by actually working together in the group. The other thing is I like the idea. So there is content. Obviously, there needs to be content. There is research behind it. There is some industry data. But then each week you're expected to engage with that in your real life, and then use the Voxer to get the support back up, feedback, questions, you know, walk through when you're getting stuck or sticky. So it's not like you just go out and practice, which happens in a lot of programs, you know, go and take this exercise, tell us how you get on when you come back. This is decide how you want to interact with this concept, go and see how it affects things, and you have the group to come back to, but you also have the private contact with me. And that means that you have someone kind of thinking with you, so that you're not just adopting what I think is inclusive leadership. You are expanding and developing it to be your version, still using the research, still with the core concepts, but you're thinking about how you would do it. So like some inclusive leaders are like quiet and don't speak much, you know, and I used to think I had to be that way, but actually I'm just chatty. I would rather say the thing than wonder about the thing, and I'll forget it if I don't say it. So I started to realize that everybody has their own kind of way of being, and inclusive leadership is a set of practices. And if we can close the gap between the practices and your way of being, so that you can figure out what the behavior is between the ideal practices and your way of being, that honors who you are, but allows you to leverage inclusion and inclusive leadership. So that's what we work on, is the space between those two things, so that you can still be yourself rather than this perfect version of a leader with the same confusion, questions, fears, desires, but you can also then know what behaviors suit you that would allow you to be inclusive in your practices, to be an effective leader, but to do it without letting go of who you are. And I think maybe the other term is, in inclusive leadership, and this is for anyone listening, social leadership is as important as positional leadership or thought leadership. So positional leadership is anyone with a formal leadership position. Social leadership is anyone who influences anyone else. Because if you think about leadership, you need a followership. So a followership is when someone agrees to go into a point with you, or to go into a step with you, or to move somewhere with you. And so inclusive leadership is a shared or distributed leadership model, meaning that you don't need formal power to be an inclusive leader. Some people seem to naturally adopt some of the practices. Some people need support for very good reasons, didn't have it role modeled, don't know how to manage the anxiety, don't know what to do with the fear, you know, don't know how to balance the anxieties of the organization with the needs of the team to perform. Or somebody's a thought leader, they go out into the world and they influence people, but they don't necessarily have direct reports. But actually, if they were using inclusive practices, they would be more influential with less effort. You know, so it's for thought leaders, social leaders, and positional leaders. And sometimes people say, well, you know, are there enough senior leaders on this? Should I, you know, or, oh, I'm not a senior leader, should I be on this? We have found that regardless of what type of leader you are, using inclusive leadership practices, the more differences in that room, including positional, the more learning, that actually all forms of difference add value. It doesn't actually mean someone is less valuable or less helpful, which blows most people's minds away. They're like, really? And I'm like, yeah, because in inclusive leadership, the more differences we have in the room, the more learning to be had, the more sameness, the less learning. It's just how it works. And so it kind of contradicts all the rules about leadership and management and you know, seniority and stuff, because it's kind of saying that's part of the issue, is that if you're only with those who you have kind of close experience with, your likelihood to be inclusive is high, but your likelihood of being inclusive of all is low. You'll be inclusive because people like you are around you. It's easy to include people like you. But inclusive leadership is that actually, regardless of who's around you, you can have the skills to influence and leverage and support people and outcomes that are important to you. Yeah, and I just think that that's really quite powerful, because it kind of goes against the narrative that a lot of leadership is focused on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like it goes against most people's experience of, like, as you were, most people's, I'm going to say, yeah, most people's experience of what leadership is, which then when you're speaking about it, I'm wondering, is the overall, what was popping into my head was there's less pressure on somebody to exclude themselves if they're a leader, which means they can bring more of themselves to the room in a way that takes off unnecessary pressure that doesn't need to be on, which is holding them back from actually leading, and then makes it possible for more people to have to be more genuine impact on people so that they can also show up more. So it feels like there's like the image coming into my head is like you're either um uh oh the image coming into my head. You know that image of, like you said, galaxy earlier on. It's like
Mm,
an all the planets, everything's connected and they can see the relationship with each other is what you're speaking about versus um I guess the leadership models I would have seen growing up and stuff is there's a lot of people in a room and there's one person at the top of the room and you listen to them and you either get it or you don't. But if you don't get it, there's something wrong with you. And if you get it, brilliant, you're the same as the leader, which is essentially what you're saying is
yeah.
moving in the direction of a different, more inclusive, but more impactful approach for everyone. It's when you're speaking about social leadership, I was really, oh yeah, when I go to the shops, this is a practice too.
Yeah, yeah. Like, yeah, no, it's interesting because there are times where you need like an individual leader for things. And even inclusive leaders, sometimes you might have to be at the top of the room. You know what I mean? And your voice might need to um, be the defining factor for lots of very valid reasons. The issue is, or the skill is, an inclusive leader knows when that's what's needed and adds value because they have a lens of thinking rather than it being a default because I don't know how else to utilize the power that I have. And so therefore I assume I'm the most informed person to have this discussion, or my point of view is the most right, or but it's not that you wouldn't do that. And I think that's what's interesting about inclusive leadership is that your decision making is so well informed that you can adapt and take in new data as it arrives and therefore be impactful. Um, one of the big things with inclusive leadership or any effective leadership, remembering that my background's affected, leadership development, it isn't D&I. Inclusion has been in everything I've done just because of where I come from, my background, the way I see the world, my kind of social work, my not-for-profit work, my community work. But it's not coming from this position of that D&I comes from, because that's not my background. It's performance. Coaching psychology ultimately is performance. Leadership development is ultimately performance. And inclusive leadership sets people up to perform better in environments regardless of power sourcing. So it helps you utilize the power available, share the power available, make decisions about the power. Whereas a lot of people wait for positional power and then they don't know how to do things differently. And so inclusive leadership is just, in my opinion, more robust. And anyone that I notice that does it well solves problems in ways that those who don't. So I have a big joke about, like, if you're the if you're the leader and you're standing at the top of the room, you are limiting the whole room to the level of your incompetence. But when you're an inclusive leader, you are limiting the room to the level of incompetence that the whole group can achieve together, which will always outrank an individual. And we know that because there's exercises like from the likes of NASA where they get you to do group work, and it becomes evident that the solutions you come up with individually never outrank when the group come together and then discuss the solution that they need. And so,
Mm.
yeah, so like when you're an inclusive leader, you just raise the level of incompetence in the room. Um, but when you're just relying on yourself, we will limit others to the level of our own competency or incompetence if we are the kind of if we don't know how to be inclusive. So that's kind of what I'm pointing to. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. There's something else that was coming into my head and it's gone because I got a call. Um,
That's cool.
lead in.
Mm,
There's some lead in. Oh yes, leader. So if people are watching this back, and they might, in the same way that I think I would have almost assumed. I think straight away I would have assumed, now this is a leadership course, and I don't run a business around, so it's not for me. That would have been my initial
mm,
thought. So in terms of leader and who it's for and who it would benefit, and it's funny, I'm throwing in two questions now. People ping me on this because I always say don't ask, try your best not to ask two questions at once. But here we go. Um, that's the first question.
okay.
And then No, go with that, and then my other question will evolve.
So from a effectiveness point of view, we're now teaching school kids leadership skills. We're teaching secondary school kids leadership skills. We're teaching people in university leadership skills, because what's actually needed is the capacity to lead. And I don't mean lead competitively, like where there's always one boss. We need people who can collaborate and work together for future solutions. We know organizations are looking for this. That doesn't necessarily mean management. Leadership is when you can influence people forward. Yes, formal leaders need this, definitely. Leaders who want to be formal leaders need this. If the group was full of people who weren't formal leaders, then I would say, oh, that would be out of balance. But I'm watching the balance of participants, and we're not out of balance. So if you are somebody who wants to be more influential, wants to be more impactful, wants to understand inclusion from a more nuanced point of view, wants to think about how you can have an impact on people when they're around you that leaves them feeling better, more important, less broken, less not good enough, less of all of the crap none of us want to feel, then the likes of LEADIN is really helpful, because there is a structure that's related to how you implement it. So you will get to practice it, and there is a portfolio, but also there's nobody who doesn't need to know how to do this. I teach, like, I do my best for my nieces and nephews to have some of these concepts, because they are required in our world. Just like emotional intelligence was this kind of big thing, and now everyone needs to have it. Well, we know that inclusive leadership is really important and is starting to be asked of people. And so, just like 10 years ago, we didn't know that there would be a load of jobs outsourced to AI. Maybe some people did, I didn't. And 100 years ago, we didn't know a load of jobs would be outsourced to machines. The people coming out of university, coming out of school now, going into primary schools, they need the skills to work with differences better, to critically think, to influence people effectively rather than dominantly, to be seen as someone who's helpful in the world, who is effective. All of those things are needed for every role, in every part of society. And so any space you can influence is a space where you could be leading, and you might be leading and you don't know it. So that's why I kind of say we need a balance. We do need formal leaders, but you also need people who have maybe more informal or social roles or thought leadership roles. And previous participants have ranged across all of those, from thought leaders to independent practitioners to very senior leaders across organizations across Europe and wider field as well. So if you want to be impactful and you want to be someone who influences and maybe has more capability and skills and inclusion that result in influencing, in having a positive impact, supporting more equity in the world, in organizations, in your world, then it would probably be a good fit. It is most ideally designed for people in organizations or at the top of an organization, but the best learning comes from a mix of people in the room. So we tailor what you learn to what you need. So if you're like, oh well, that isn't 100% me, but that's why the Voxer piece there, that's why the implementation, that's why the portfolio is there. Yeah.
Okay, lovely. So there's okay, brilliant. Okay, don't want to keep you too long, but there was something else that I thought was important to say, which was the idea of selling something. And so this course, for example, for me, um, for me, it's I can fit so I want to be more inclusive because I know there's definitely areas where I'm definitely not. I think this course will be really, really helpful. Um, and the big difference in this course is, I guess, my experience of you as a person and a professional, and I feel it'll be of substantial benefit and
Mm.
value and real value or something. And my question was if there was people. So this is my question: when people are reaching out I know you're doing a 15-minute chat. I think potentially today
Yeah,
or tomorrow.
tomorrow if anyone needs it. Yeah.
Yeah, and so whether this is relevant or not. So for me, when people say that, generally, I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, you're going to try and sell me something.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm going to ask you because I know my experience of you means you genuinely. Oh yeah. So in relation to that call, alignment, and when you say 15 minutes, I know that you don't mean I'm going to try and sell something to you. But so I'd just
No,
love to speak to that in
I,
whatever
I
way you're
love I
choosing.
love I love that, because I do not ever sign up for any of those 15 minutes because I hate being sold to. And I also hate the fact that there's this like indirect manipulation can occur. And I just, at that point, I don't even want to work with a professional.
Yeah.
Like, even if I think they're really helpful. So the first thing is, and if you've seen me post anywhere, I'm like, in brackets, this is not a sales call. So obviously, if lead in is for you, I'm going to be like, oh my God, that's a good fit, right? Because obviously that's what we're talking about. I'll tell you that. I've already told a number of people not to do this and redirected them to other courses because there were some other courses that I thought were a better fit. Some people have said, look, I'm looking at these two things. And I've said, okay, look, tell me what you want, what you're trying to achieve. And then I've looked and gone, look, realistically, that is giving you that thing that you need, so do that. And for others, I've just said it's not the right time. Not because they couldn't learn something, but because the reality was they were putting extra things on their plate when actually what they needed was some support with what's on their plate, not to take on more. And I suppose I say this because, and it's the same with my free consultations for leadership coaching, is like I refer out about a third of those calls. I invite in about a third if I think they're a good fit. And I suggest about a third do something else, like not even go to another coach, that is something else they need. So the 15-minute call is quite simple. If you're interested in LEADIN, you tell me why you're interested, what your worries are, what you're trying to achieve, and then I'll be like, okay, well, what you're interested in probably doesn't align, or you're not going to get that from this. Have you thought about that? Or, you know, thanks for being interested. I'm delighted we're having a chat, but this isn't for you. And then other times be like, yeah, that's what you'll get out of the course, you know. And I mean that because I hate being sold to, and because the other thing that's really important is if the wrong people go on the course. So if you go on the course and you're only going on the course for a certificate, you're in the wrong place, because the amount of work that you will do live on the calls with me, that you'll do in terms of reflection within your own world, no certificate ever will value to that degree. So certificates you get, but that shouldn't be the main motivation, you know. If you want to, you know, be more skilled in something, you want to have more comfort, you want to be able to measure your own practice better, then that's LEADIN, because we design those frameworks for you on the program with you. If you want to tick a box, it's not worth the effort. There's easier courses to do, you know. But if you want to be more competent and confident and effective, and you're curious, but you also have a sense that you learn well by sharing moments with others and by practicing things in action, you're not just wanting a load of knowledge, you actually want to bring it into action, then it's good. So yeah, it is not a sales call. Also, I'm awful at selling because I hate that feeling of like selling. I think that we attract people. Some people will think they'll get something from your course, and then I'll tell them that they won't. If they won't, and if they will, I'll say that. But I'd be more like, if you're curious, if you think it might be something and you're just not calling me because you're just not booking because you know previous experiences that they sell at you or they talk at you, look, you're more likely actually at the end of the 15 minutes anyway to get an idea of what you need for what you're looking for, regardless of whether it's with LEADIN or not. So it's not a sales call. And there are limited places. I think that's really important to say, because it is going to be an intimate group. Because of the level of learning. Like if I had a really big group, I couldn't give the level of care every day to Unboxer. So it's not going to be anywhere. I'd be like, you know, and I'm already up the walls, but I have scheduled time in every single day to take care of Voxer Monday to Friday for the group, because I want people to leave and be like, oh my God, I got more than I wanted, more than I thought I needed. I have more hope. I have a bigger vision. I'm clearer about where I can bring this and how I can influence. And I have a confidence in my practice without requiring myself to be perfect. You know I have the ability to manage the difficulties that come up sometimes. And I have skills and frameworks and insights that I didn't beforehand. Like I want people to be wow, because that results in much more sustainable implementation. I get better results for people who are on the program. You know, like they get better results. They then think the program's better than if I just get a load of people and then I kind of like one and done them. It's just not a good business model. But also, as an Irish person, maybe I'm just a bit like, I hate being sold to. If I want it, I'll buy it. I just need certain information. That's the point of the call. You need certain clarities. Talk to me about it. I'll tell you if it's there or not. And then if I say something's there and it's not, and you're on the program, you're going to be able to say it's not there. So like, I can't get away from it. I can't you know what I mean? So yeah. So yeah, it's not a sales call, but it is a call for you to kind of be like, okay, I want to pick your brains about it. Is it a good fit for what I need? And then I'll say yes or no, and you can go away and decide. Like, you don't have to say anything to me on the call. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
yeah, and I love you bringing that up, Thomas, because I cringe at those calls and I avoid them, even though I need to know something. I try to find
Yeah.
a different way to find it out because I don't want to be in that awkward call. It won't be awkward. We'll chat about what you need.
Yeah.
You'll go away and think about it, make a decision. Job
Yeah.
done.
Brilliant. Super. Yeah, no, I said I'd ask because I know my own
Yeah.
had experiences in the past, and I was thinking there's someone who could be interested. And I got done in the past. And when I say I got done in the past, I just didn't have the capacity to say no. You know, one of those
I
manipulative calls where it's like, take out your credit card. And I was like, and they're like, where they manipulate it into the,
Yeah,
the
and you're like,
manipulation
do
trade.
you need this? And you're like, yes. Well, you said you want this. Do you want to be stuck here again? Well, no. Well, then what's that credit card number? And you're like reading the credit card going, I have no money on the credit card.
Yeah.
What do I do? Yeah, none of that crap. I don't even ask you to tell me on the call if you're going to join.
Yeah.
Just, it's about what you need. Let's have a chat. What I would say is how we sell in our work tells you a lot about how we're going to practice. And so I believe that the very first conversation, the very first post you read, the very first email is telling you something about the way I'm going to work with you.
Yeah.
And if I'm being manipulative, if I'm putting you under pressure, if I conned you into a call to help, then I sell to you. That tells you something about my work. That's not who I want to be. That's not how I want to practice. It's not how I need to practice. But
So,
also, and I would reverse that and say part of that actually helps other people within the course. Like, think about how they sometimes present themselves for interviews in a needy way, or how they underestimate their own value or cling too tightly to an outcome. Like, I really do believe that to be able to work with inclusive leadership, I have to be constantly learning and practicing. I'm not done. I'm going to be like, oh my God, that wasn't very inclusive. Right, I got to think about that. But that also comes down to the very first call we have, or yeah, how we discuss things. And the only other thing I would say is we have really cool people on the program, like really cool. And the shared learning that is available is something I couldn't even sell or like explain, because I can't say what it will be, but because I know from closer and more distant interactions with current participants, I know what they're individually bringing. I have no idea about what they're going to bring as a collective. So I could never actually really tell you what you're really going to get. I can
yeah.
only tell you what I can guarantee. And that's what's listed on the sales page. But participants usually leave with much more than that.
Yeah. So
Um,
exciting.
yeah.
Yeah,
Okay, we better go because I definitely need meds for this and you definitely need meds for yours. And we're going to be like going over and being like,
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
but
Okay.
thank you for chatting to me because, and I suppose for anyone listening, one of the reasons we did this was I'm dyslexic, so when I write things, it doesn't communicate things very well, I think. And also Thomas and me get into a zone.
Now it
And when
was
we're talking, I just think it's better though. Like, I just feel more like I can just be myself. Whereas when I'm trying to explain something and someone doesn't know me, it can feel a little bit like something else to me. Yeah.
yeah. And the last thing before I go, I will say is I'm more excited about it now because it makes a lot. It already made sense to me, but now it makes more sense to why um all the bits and pieces. So I've come very far, but it feels like all the bits and pieces that I'm missing to actually stand into my own, yeah, stand into myself and out there in a more way that feels right, so I can actually feel strong in my approach versus it being wrong because it goes against what I'm used to seeing. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think that feeling right, it's very difficult to be an inclusive leader if we don't feel connected to ourselves,
Mm,
and feel authority within ourselves. And that doesn't mean authority over others. And it doesn't mean that we're right, as in right above others. It means that I have to feel right within myself to be able to make these calls and decisions. Um, yeah,
mm,
and I think a lot of the stuff we've talked about is really hard to put in words, like in writing. But I think it's easier to be like, oh, that's what that's about.
yeah.
Um, yeah, and
Okay.
even you being on the program is like, yeah,
Mm,
very exciting. Um, because I really do believe in the shared learning. I'm not one of these people who say, yeah, we'll have some shared learning. Well, secretly, I think I'm the smartest in the room. And we all know what that feels like when people are like, yes, shared learning is very good. And then they, clearly they don't think that. So I have to say there's a lot of value coming from participants that I can't write on a sales page or explain very well, but the felt experience of it is there. And today, anytime we get the groups in the room, that's what they say. Like,
Yeah.
and I can't script that stuff, or I can only facilitate. So that's what we try to
Yeah.
do.
Okay. Brilliant. Okay. Sheila, pleasure to have the chat,
Yeah.
as always. I hope that when people watch it back, they get a feel. I think that was my thing, was like people get more of a feel for yourself, what the program's really about. That, yeah, and if it feels right, it'll feel right, and they'll reach out.
Yeah, yeah. And what I will say is, like, you can call tomorrow, like you can find the links, they'll be available, like whatever. But also if you're like, oh, I'm interested, but not this time, let me know, because that might also be handy for you to be like, does this work for me, but I can't do it this time. That's okay too. Um, like I really am trying to build up a community of inclusive leaders. Well, like I use Ellis, effective leadership and inclusive solutions, and that's what I want to do. That's not a short-term thing. um
Mm,
that's really about making sure that people have connections to each other and what they need, and that we're expanding that stuff. So you can get in contact either way, even if this time isn't right for you.
mm,
That's fine as well.
yeah.
You're still a valuable person that I'm willing to hear from
Yeah.
and talk to. You know what I mean? Because sometimes it's like, oh well, if I'm not, if I'm not what she wants to talk to now, or then I can't reach out and have that conversation or ask those questions. You
Yeah.
can, um,
Very
because
few
these things
notes.
are far bigger picture than whether you join this Friday or not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Thomas, let's go, because you and me go on for 5
Yeah.
hours.
Take care.
Have a
Enjoy
good
your
rest
evening.
today. Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome.
Take care.
Pleasure.